I'm Cathy Eatock. I'm a Ngari and Bachelor woman, and I'm co-chair of the Indigenous Peoples Organisation of Australia. And I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. This series is being hosted by the Indigenous Peoples Organisation, or IPO, which is a national coalition of 285 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations and individual members across Australia. The IPO was established as a members-driven voluntary body to facilitate collaborative advocacy of Indigenous rights at the United Nations and to promote the enactment of internationally recognised Indigenous rights standards within Australia. The NAIDOC theme of healing country was too important to not use as an opportunity to consider issues related to our rights to manage our lands and waterways. We know Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices and rights related to our lands and waters are too often suppressed over more powerful corporate and mining agendas. We also know Indigenous peoples, though the lowest contributors to global warming, are disproportionately impacted by the effects of rising temperatures and rising sea levels. So the IPO is hosting the webinar series and follow-up workshop to promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander concerns around climate change and land and water rights, and to develop priorities that we'll be promoting both nationally and to feed into the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow in November. The Heal Country, Heal Climate webinar series is a collaboration with Better Futures Australia, which is a network of partners bringing together all sectors of the Australian community to co-design and drive ambitious climate action. Better Futures works to build local cross-sectoral networks by showcasing opportunities and solutions to create sustainable jobs, regenerate industries and communities, and invites all Australians to join a growing community in advocating for a national response to reach zero emissions by 2050 or sooner. We know First Nations people have lived sustainably on this continent for at least 60,000 years. So we know also that there are lessons for the Australian community and indeed the broader international community on the need to find a balance, to respect the rights of all peoples and the rights of all living things, and the need to pull back from the climate catastrophe we're facing. But before we move on, however, I'd like to ask Pastor Ray Minniecon to do an acknowledgement of country for us. Thank you, Ray.
Thanks. Pardon me. Thanks, Cathy. Oh, pardon me. And happy NAIDOC week, everybody. But as we know, every day is NAIDOC Day for Aboriginal people. So I'm Ray Minniecon. I'm from the Cubby Cubby people on my father's side, or Gubby Gubby, as some say. And on my mother's side, I'm Ngarrindjeri, which is from Bundaberg North. I was born on my mother's country there in Bundaberg. And I also, on my father's side, I have an ancestor who was forcibly removed from Ambrym Island. And actually, the name Minniecon comes from that particular island there. And I have those wonderful 3 connection points to Cubby Cubby land, Ngarrindjeri, as well as Ambrym. And I'm living here on Gadigal country. And so in order to welcome you all to all the various countries and acknowledge all the various countries that you're coming from, I'm holding in my hand here a piece of soil from whose land I now live on. This is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I want to acknowledge the wisdom, knowledge, and expertise of the Gadigal ancestors in their custodianship of these lands that I now call my home. I acknowledge and recognize their ancestors whose wisdom have cared for this land for millennia. And through this soil, I recognize and acknowledge the families and children of the Gadigal clan who lived and celebrated and communed together on these lands. I also acknowledge and recognize all the blood that was shed on these lands, either in violence or in innocence. I want to acknowledge and recognize the elders who have come recently, who have toiled and died on these lands, and have left us a legacy that all people can enjoy the benefits of their labor on this soil today. I also acknowledge the responsibility I have in stewarding and caring for this soil and these lands. This responsibility now rests on my shoulders. My responsibility is care for the land and soil upon which I now live, so that our children's children can celebrate and enjoy the fruits of the soil, so that they too can live a healthy, prosperous and happy life on the land and soil of the Gadigal people. I also acknowledge and recognize our collective responsibility that we all have to care for all the lands and the soils that we have the honor to be birthed upon, to live upon, and to work upon. So let's affirm our connection to the lands we now live and work upon. Let's acknowledge our elders who have worked on these lands for our benefit. Let us pledge that we too will steward the land according to the wisdom, knowledge, and expertise that we now possess, so that we can pass on to our children's children the best that our land can provide for them and their children's children. Let's also undertake together the important task to care for our Mother Earth, so that our future generations are not robbed or deprived of their rightful inheritance. That is our responsibility to pass on to them, so that they can enjoy the same entitlements and benefits that we have enjoyed on these lands that we call our home. And I want to make a declaration here tonight too, before I pass it back. I make this declaration based upon two very important Australian High Court decisions, the Mabo decision and the Love versus the Commonwealth decision, Love and Trump versus the Commonwealth. 4 declarations. The first declaration is this: I want to declare that all Indigenous peoples are entitled as against the whole world to possession, occupation, use, and enjoyment of the lands of their ancestors. Secondly, I want to declare that all Indigenous peoples are not outsiders or foreigners in their own lands. They are the descendants of the first peoples of their country, the original inhabitants, and they are to be recognized as such. Thirdly, I declare that none of the events of invasion, settlement, federation, or the advent of foreign citizenships laws have displaced the unique position of Indigenous peoples with their lands. And fourthly, I want to declare that Indigenous peoples have a unique connection to their country. It is just not ancestry or place of birth or even both. Indigenous peoples have a connection with the land, waters, and skies under Indigenous laws and customs. No imposed Citizenship Act has removed or modified that connection. No parliament or foreign government has removed or modified that connection by any other laws or legislation. And so we can affirm tonight that we have the right to live out our lives in a peaceful existence with all our human families. We have the right to access, live, and walk on the sacred lands of our ancestors, so that we may touch the land, our mother, that has been faithfully cared for us by our ancestors. We have the right to live up the bounty of Mother Earth, and we have the right to be who our Creator made us to be, and live in the freedom of who our Creator made us to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pastor Ray, for that powerful and moving acknowledgement of country. Today's session, Custodians of Country, is the first of 5 daily sessions, with each covering different themes. Tuesday is Healing Our Waterways. Wednesday, it's Healing Country. Thursday, it's Community Healing. And Friday is Pursuing Global Justice. We're extremely fortunate to have a number of prominent and passionate speakers to outline some critical issues facing our communities across each of these sessions. In the following days, we'll have speakers on the desecration of country. Cato Muir will speak of the travesty of the destruction of the globally significant 46,000-year-old Juukan Gorge caves, which were referred to by archaeologists as recording the dawning of humanity. And we'll discuss the need to strengthen state and federal Aboriginal cultural and heritage and native title legislation and call for a veto for traditional owners over sacred sites. We'll hear how mining and profits for corporations has been prioritised at the expense of traditional owners, with Adrian Birragubba speaking on how the native title rights of the Wangan and Jagalingou people were unilaterally extinguished to enable the Adani mine to profiteer from a massive coal mine that also threatens the Great Barrier Reef and the climate, with a huge predicted emissions load. We'll hear from Anne Polina and Bruce Shillingsworth on Aboriginal perspectives on river systems as living entities and the need to hand back water rights to Aboriginal people. We'll hear about the threat of fracking from Gadrian Hassan and the devastating and tragic impact of pollutants such as Agent Orange on Aboriginal people of the Kimberley by Arnie Lena Fraser. But we'll also hear how remote communities are leading the way with solar panels, harnessing energy from the sun to provide consistent and cheap energy. We'll also hear of how the Torres Strait 8 are taking legal action in the Human Rights Council against the Australian government for failing to act against the threat of rising sea levels as the first case worldwide to link climate change to people's rights to culture, and how this is part of a larger movement globally to hold governments and corporations to account. And we have some passionate speakers here today. This session will cover the role of First Nations peoples as custodians of country. It'll outline how Aboriginal people aren't separate from the lands and rivers, which reflect our ancestors in all living things. It'll explain our obligations as custodians of country and our responsibility to future generations. We'll draw on the lessons we can learn from traditional law and Aboriginal perspectives as caretakers of country, and the need for the respect of First Nations decision-making as confirmed in international law, which sets out international Indigenous rights to self-determination and the legal principle of free, prior and informed consent. We'll have some time for questions as well before we finish up with a short film, Our Common and Shared Future, which provides a beautiful portrayal of the relationship between the traditional owners and the 700-kilometre long Fitzroy River. But we'll move on to our first speaker, who is Chris Bonney, a proud Narunga, Gutjimara and Ngarrindjeri man who has a long history of working for communities and with a background in marketing and communications. Chris is also committed to supporting MOB to advocate for our rights and is a valued member of the IPO executive. Chris has offered to share his knowledge of the Ngarrindjeri dreaming to give some insight into the values of traditional law, passed from generation to generations for millennium. This is just one of many Aboriginal dreaming stories that outline cultural obligations for Aboriginal people to live sustainably and respectfully within our environment. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. So everyone can hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, sorry, just checking. So my name is Chris Bonney. It's a privilege to be here. I'm Narunga and Gunditjmara and Ngarrindjeri and Acknowledgement. So my country is in South Australia. I was born in Mount Gambier, and I'd like to, I'm here speaking, going to tell you a dreaming story from Ngarrindjeri, from my grandfather's country, about sustainability. But before that, I'd just like to say, acknowledge that I'm on, I live in Sydney and in lockdown on Gadigal country. I've been here for 25 years and acknowledge there the people, the families, the elders, past and present, and also to everyone else on listening in who's Indigenous, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, and also Australians and other people from diverse backgrounds. And together we can work together to make a better environment for ourselves, a better lives, a better society for ourselves. And we're all kind of like dealing with lockdown and things like that. So we've been indoors for a week. So I'm here to talk about a story that I was taught when I was a young boy. It's called Thukri. And the story is Ngarrindjeri from South Australia, where the River Murray meets the ocean, creates a 150 kilometre lagoon, inland lagoon of salt and fresh water. The River Murray comes in, and there it's about beautiful food, beautiful bush tucker, beautiful country. And there's a great story about sustainability, which is very relevant for our discussion. And that story is of Thukri. Now, Thukri, the bony bream, a beautiful fish that people would go and hunt for, fish for, and eat, and had no bones. So you could just eat it, and the flesh was amazing, and families loved it. And this story is about two fellows from Ngarrindjeri country. They go out hunting one day, fishing, to bring some tucker home for dinner. They wanted to have a bit of a feast, and they said to their wives that they're going out to go and get some fish, and the wives said, well, we're going to go and get some bush, from some plants and that, to bring to the tucker, to bring to the table. So the two men headed off on their canoes, and canoeing out and looking around at a very good spot. The water was calm, there was, it was a beautiful day. And then they went, hey, let's go over here. Let's go into that little lagoon there, little cove there. So they brought their canoe up, paddled up, then they got to this sheltered place and they thought, let's fish here. So they got their fishing lines out, made from reeds and fish bones, and then they just threw one in. One did, and then the other fella, he threw his in. Well, that fish was biting. So the first bite, hey, look at me, my brother. I'm getting a bite here. And the other brother goes, hey, I am too. And they collected. They were just, those fish were hungry to bite that, the hooks. And so they kept on fishing. And they were from 1, 2, 5, 100, 50. So all these fish, and then the boat got a bit rocky, and they thought, hey, we better slow down. We better stop fishing now, because we've got too much on the boat now, and we might fall down, fall over into the lagoon. And so they said, let's go back to shore and let's have a feast with the family. So what they did was they come in canoeing up, and they just coming, getting close to the shore, and they saw this fella standing on the shoreline. And they're looking, thinking, hey, who's this fella? We don't know him, I haven't seen him before. And so they go, okay, let's hide the fish because we don't want to share the fish. But they had hundreds of fish, but they just didn't want to share them. So they covered it up with reeds, mats and that. And then they went, okay, let's go. So we don't have enough food. So they canoed right up to the shoreline, and this fella comes up to them and goes, hey, my brothers, how you going? They go, hey, how you going there? And he goes, I'm hungry, I haven't eaten for days. Just wondering, can you give me some food? Can you give me some of that fish that you got there? And these two fellows looked at the fish, they looked at the pole, the mats, and they looked at the man, and they looked at each other, and they thought, no, we don't want to share. So they said, one said, no, sorry, brother, we don't have any more fish. We don't, we just got enough for our family. But you could go fishing up there. You could get some up that way. So the man looked at them. He's scratching his head, and he looked at both of them. Then he looked at the pole that was covered with mats, and then looked at the fellas again, and he turned around and he went to walk away. And those two fellas went, oh, yeah, deadly, he's gone now. But the old fella stopped and then turned around. And he said, "You lied to me, you fellas. You have plenty of fish in there. You lied and you were greedy. Your greed made you lie. So from now on, that fish there, you won't be able to enjoy it. You won't be able to sit there with your families, with your little children and eat it without any bones. Because now that fish, that tukari, has bones everywhere. That's your punishment." And so he walked off. And then two fellas acting real nadagi, which is, acting real cool, looked at each other and went, "That fella's bunta." And they went, "Yeah, okay, then let's go and have a feed then." So they went to get the fish and they wanted to start preparing the fish before they found, before the wives came and the children. And as they were cutting, they noticed that the fish had all these bones, all these thick bones, thin bones, so many bones that they could not eat that fish properly. So many bones that their children could not eat that fish because they may choke. And they went, "Oh, we've got to go back to the family. We've got to tell them what happened. We've got to be honest." So they went to the family and they told the story of what happened. They bought all this fish, but they couldn't eat it. And then the elders from the family said, "That old fella was Ngarrindjeri, our ancestral spirit. And Ngarrindjeri has taught you a lesson about being greedy, about taking too much fish that you could destroy, you could not, overfish. So the lesson here is that you must be sustainable. You must share your foods, but also you must make sure you don't overfish or you don't over farm, because that is going to keep us going forever." So this is my story of Tukari, a sustainability story. And I hope you enjoy it, but it's just a lesson for us all because it's telling us that we must look after our environment. And so I'm very proud to be able to sit here and tell you that story. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That's just a brief insight into the traditional principles that have guided Aboriginal culture over thousands of generations. So thanks for that, Chris. Our next speaker is Uncle Bruce Pascoe. We're very honoured to have Uncle Bruce join us here tonight. Bruce is the celebrated author of Dark Emu, which challenged previous colonial conceptions of pre-contact Aboriginal culture. Bruce used the colonisers' own documented evidence to argue that the complexity of Aboriginal culture was suppressed, ignoring sophisticated agricultural techniques such as the intricate fish traps and denying the partly sedentary nature of some Aboriginal communities to justify the British assertion of terra nullius and the expropriation of our lands. Dark Emu has brought attention to the richness and nuances of Aboriginal culture and connection to country, and adds another layer to the legacy of the egalitarian and collective reciprocity of Aboriginal culture. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Chris, for that great story about the wisdom of our people. I'm on Yuin country, down in far east Gippsland on the New South Wales-Victorian border. And my uncle brought me here in 1968 and told me the story of this country in relation to our family. And only 7 or 8 years ago, my auntie reiterated our connection to this country. So I'm very grateful to them, but I'd like to acknowledge all the people who have been and gone from this country, and those who are on here now and will be. in the future, and all of whom have the responsibility of looking after country. And so many of our stories are about sharing and caring about country and food and each other. And we're running a farm here at the moment with Yuin people in conjunction with Twofold Aboriginal Corporation, and we are cooperating with many other Aboriginal nations who want to do similar things. So we all help each other, and we share the workload over a wide area. But our old songlines used to do that in the past, and we feel as if we are doing that today when we travel north of here and meet up with people in Wollongong. We're still on our own land, different language, name, same people, different plants, but same purpose, looking after country. So on the farm here, we are growing the old people's foods. And the reason we started doing that was because what we noticed when Australians showed enthusiasm for our foods, that's all it was. It was just enthusiasm. A greediness, Chris, you could say. Greedy for our foods, but no reciprocity. And that is represented by the fact that of all the money that's made out of Aboriginal foods, 1% of it goes to Aboriginal people. Now, I don't know how we can live with ourselves as a country when that fact is so blatant. You know, we talk about closing gaps and things like that. But if we're going to enjoy the foods of Aboriginal people, surely we are going to include Aboriginal people in the benefits. But I wasn't so confident about that. So we started growing those foods ourselves as a political act in some ways. A political act to indicate our enjoyment of those foods, but our connection to them. But also, the thing that concerned me was that when the Yorta Yorta had their claim to their land dismissed by the judge, Olney, he said that their culture had been washed away by the tide of history. And I could see the shadow of that falling over our Aboriginal foods, that if we ever had to go to court to say, hang on a minute, you know, these are our foods, we domesticated these foods, we've got a spiritual and intellectual property in these foods, I was scared that some judge would say, oh, that was in the past. Your rights have been washed away by the tide of history. And so on the farm, we just don't grow food, we also practice culture, because we want to invest those foods with the spiritual stories that the old people here, still alive, teach us. When they come down to the farm, we get a new story every time. And it's a great reassurance that those stories exist, and it's a great reassurance that we're encouraged to assist those stories in living on with young men and women on the farm at Yumbara, which is Black Duck, and this is Black Duck country from here to Wollongong. And it's one of our joys to see Black Duck on the water where we grow the food, because we feel like Black Duck is looking after us and looking after the food. One of the foods we're growing is a family of grasses. And we don't just grow one grass. We don't just grow one tuber. We grow families because they come along in families. They look after each other. We have kangaroo grass, we have spear grass, we have what we call mamaja naluk, which is dancing grass. And amongst them are the orchids. And those orchids are delicious. And people say, well, you can't harvest the grass and the orchids at the same time. But in fact, we can, because that's what the old people did. Some of the grasses mature in January. Some of the grasses mature in May and June. Some of the grasses are ready in October. The orchids have a span almost right across the whole year. So there's always food there. So we can go into that paddock and harvest food right across the year, like the old people did. And the Western science for that is in the soil. Because if you dig a hole in that soil deep enough, say 0.5 metre deep, in that profile, you'll see the change. The first 200 years in that soil profile, big chunks of carbon from bushfire. Before that, real fine grained carbon right through, because that's our people there. And this has been told to me by a soil scientist, a non-Aboriginal soil scientist. He got a shock when he did that profile because he's used to looking at that first 6 inches. When he looked lower, he said, well, that's people burning there. That's not bushfire. That's your people burning. And I don't know, there might have been 7, 8 UN people there that day. And I had tears in my eyes that those young people would look down at that soil profile and say, there it is. There's the evidence of our people on this land. And, you know, we know the old people have been there because the place it's a beautiful place beside the Salt River. It has freshwater lakes and swamps. And everywhere there's evidence of our old people. You'll have to excuse my dog, Yambala, because he's knocking the computer. He's gone to bed now. But there's food all through there, but there's also trees where coolamons have been taken off. There's laced trees, but there's stone everywhere, stone that the old people used. So we feel at home there, and we like to bring the young kids there. We like to bring the old people there and say, you know, here is our land, here is our work, here are our plants, and your young people are earning their money here. They're not receiving it from government. They are working here, and it's hard work. But the importance of our work is not just cultural, it's also environmental. And those grasses are perennial. Once they're in the ground, you never have to touch them again, apart from harvesting them, because their root mass will just grow and grow and grow. If a plant dies, and occasionally they do, the seeds will fill that hole with another plant, or its sister plant or brother plant will grow there. And all of them have these massive root masses that sequester carbon. Now, I'm pretty sure we didn't have a word for sequester carbon, but I know that our old people were aware that that's how you build soil. You build soil out of allowing all the nutrients to stay there. You build soil by not depleting it. And our current agricultural practices, the Western form of agriculture, depletes soil, and you have to replenish it with chemicals. Whereas here is a way of building soil, of loving soil, of worshipping soil in a spiritual way. It's the same with our tubers. The old people used to come along and harvest those tubers, but they never pulled the plant out of the ground. They took the tubers they needed, which is referencing Chris Bonney's story from his country, which I respect so much. The old people would take a proportion of those tubers and put them in the bag, and then they would press the plant back into the ground. So it is also perennial. These are plants that love country, look after country, and it's a whole system. And our people knew that they were no better than the soil. Our people knew that they had to look after the land so that their children, their grandchildren, but also Mother Earth could be looked after, so that the quail could be looked after, so that the snipe could be looked after, so that Ngarrindjeri, the plover, had somewhere to hide. The gullu, white-faced heron, had somewhere to eat. And it was it's a beautiful system. It's well thought out. You know, people say, you know, our people were just wanderers of the earth. And, you know, it's not bad wandering over the earth. It's a beautiful place. And wandering is great for your soul. But our people were also conscious of how we ate, how we got food, how we shared food, and how we looked after where the food came from. And the sophistication of our old people's system just always amazes me. I think back to those old people that told the story of the Bonney Brim, and I think they knew, They knew what it was required to be human on this continent, the driest continent on Earth, the least fertile continent on Earth. Those old people knew how to love and look after her. They didn't want her to be anything else. They didn't want her and to be more fertile. She was who she was, and it was up to us to protect her. And the story of the Bonney Brim goes right up that river, right up from Chris's place, right up to Brewarrina and beyond, following that old river. And, you know, Brad Stedman up there at Brewarrina tells me a story of Bonney Brim and creation of that river. And yet Brad took me for a walk a couple of kilometres away from the river, and the earth was bare, and it was blowing up into our faces because that ground was being prepared for cotton. Our people never had that country bare. In that exact place, Sir Thomas Mitchell, Australian explorer, commented that the grass was higher than his saddle. What has gone wrong? Our old people had a way of caring for land, and I'm so proud of those people. I really do shake my head at their wisdom and their courage and their care. And I think all of that, you couldn't do it without organisation. An organisation, you could call it governance, you could call it planning, you could call it social planning, whatever it was. The old people had devised it, and they had told people, just as the whale tells us people down in Yuin country, that we mustn't fight each other for land. We can get cranky, we can hit each other, we can abuse each other, we can tell bad stories about each other, but we must not take anyone else's land. And that has stood this continent in great stead. That is why our languages are where in general terms, where they've always been. That is why this country here has so many stories about mulloway, so many stories about woodworm, so many stories about whale, because that language is about this country. And the people from this country were told to look after the country. Further up in the mountains from here, there's stories about moth. We know those stories, but they're not our stories. They come from the mountain. We can go there, we can listen to those stories, we can participate in the stories, but they belong to those people. And down here, we have our own stories. We belong to our own land. Our primary objective, our responsibility is to look after land. And that took a lot of organisation. And we have to respect those old people, those old geniuses so long ago who worked this out. And it doesn't matter whether it's 120,000 years or 60 years or 25,000 years. It doesn't matter. What matters is the graciousness of those people to work it out, to understand the human animal, the aggressiveness of the human animal, its selfishness, its propensity to be violent, and work out a system that contained that a system that told those two brothers, you're being selfish. You didn't share with that old man. And now the earth is going to pay you back with bones. And when Chris was telling that story, I thought, those old people, you know, how they must have loved, how they must have cared, how they must have wished for the health of their own people, but much more they wished for the health of the land, because she comes before us. And what worries me is that in Western thought, we humans come before the land. And that is why our cultures are so different, because we think other way. We think upside down way to that we belong to land. We owe her everything. She owes us nothing. She is just beautiful. And as she is. And so I'm very proud to have heard Brother Ray, Cathy and Chris tell stories of their country, and look forward to Virginia. But I'm very proud to have been able to contribute a story which comes from this country. And it's cold tonight, and it'll be cold tomorrow morning, but it'll be beautiful tomorrow afternoon. She is a beautiful mother. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, for your insights into the different grasses and their maturing at different times, but also importantly into the Aboriginal cultural values of communal responsibility and reciprocity that all emphasised. It's been a valuable contribution to tonight's discussion. We'll move on to our next speaker. Pastor Ray has already explained where he's from, but he hasn't outlined that he's a director of Bonney Consultancies. He's Reverend and Community Chaplain in Redfern and Glebe. He's an advisor to Hope Street Urban Compassion, founder and former CEO of Kinchela Boys Home Corporation, founder of Ngarrindjeri Aboriginal Children's Home Corporation, founder of Red Dust Role Models, and council member of St Andrew's Cathedral School, and founding member of Gawara Aboriginal School. And I'm not over, as well as founder and chairperson of the Coloured Diggers Project in Redfern, former national manager of World Vision, Australia's Indigenous program, and former editor-in-chief of the National Indigenous Leadership Journal, and valued executive member of the IPO. Thank you, Ray.
You didn't have to go through all that. Bored me to tears.
Gotta acknowledge.
Look, first of all, I just want to say thank you to the NAIDOC committee for choosing such an important theme for this year, Healing Country. They've come up with some amazing themes throughout their life, and I've always reminded of the 2018 theme, which was about because of her, we can. And I think like what Bruce is saying here and Chris, because of our Mother Earth, we can. We've got to, in a sense, it's not only we can, but we must do everything we can to make sure that we protect her and look after her. So Healing Country is a really, really powerful theme. And I know we could speak about this theme for the next 20 years. Hopefully we will be here 20 years and into the future. But I'll leave it up to Virginia to let us know where we're at. But look, when this theme came out, the first thing that came into my mind was, if we're going to heal country, we need to know what it looks like before it became so wrecked. And so our creation stories tell us all of this, gives us all this evidence of what was created for us to look after and protect. And there's so many different creation stories around and potted out throughout our country. And I've been to a number of those creation story sites, and they're very powerful. And, you know, many of us can go to a place like Uluru, and we know we're in a very deeply spiritual place there, but it's also a very, very important place to tell us who we are, where we come from, and all the things necessary about our identity as people who have got these huge responsibilities to look after country. And part of that too is, for us, is just to recognize the things that connect us as Indigenous peoples, our reality that we still practice today. We still believe that, you know, we're a part of a spiritual place, and multiple spirit beings are there, or they're included, including our ancestors. They're a part of who we are. When I go back to country, I can go back to that little spot where my mother and my father, my grandparents, my grandfather, my grandparents, and my great-grandparents are buried there. And I can go and have a yarn with them. And when I hear, for example, one of my totems is the kookaburra. When I hear the kookaburra, I know that's my grandmother there. And so we live in this particular way in which everything around us is what we're connected to. And our connections to all of this, we believe, are very sacred. All land is sacred. And this new system that comes in, which separates sacred from secular, is not our philosophy. It's not our thinking. It's not our behavior. It's not the way that we live. Even though I'm living in an urban environment, these particular Indigenous realities and worldviews are still part of my makeup. I can't just dish it out the door. It's still a part of who we are. So the sacred and the secular for us are still one. We do have these, you know, religious interpretations of whatever happens. I know my eldest sister there taught us to listen to this one bird. And if you hear this bird here, Ray, you know, you got to come home or something's going to happen. And so when I hear that bird, it happens, whatever it has. And we know we also have this, you know, this struggle between all the things that we relate to. And we're people-centered, we're community-centered. We have this deep respect for our ancestors and for our old people. And one of the things that I think is missing today, one of the things that I miss the most from the old days, because I was brought up on the other side of 1967, so a lot of the old practices were still in place, intact in those days. So I miss those old ceremonies. And we call them corroborees these days, but those ceremonies were so important. I know when my father took me to my first Bonney festival down in his country, and we celebrated that time and that place there, or to those other ceremonies there. Ceremonies were so important to maintaining that equilibrium, that cosmological equilibrium, living at peace between ourselves, our environment, our nature, and also our creator. We've lost that sense of ceremony. We need to regain that. And in this climate debate that we're having, you won't hear this reinstatement of ceremony as a part of the ways in which humans interact with both the created as well as the creator. And it's something that is very deep and wholesome to my life. In looking at this topic too, one of the disturbing things that when I follow, trying to understand all the things that has taken place here is for you younger generation anyways, there was a report in 1979 and that it was called the Charney Report, C-H-A-R-N-E-Y, Charney Report. And it was the first time that scientists started to detect that there's something happening in our planet and to our Earth, that somehow the Earth is heating up. And if we keep on going down this trajectory, then we're not going to have life on Earth as we know it today. And perhaps because we're not practicing those ceremonies around those creation sites and those sacred sites as we used to do, that would keep the balance that we were looking for. And so what they discovered was that this heating up of the planet is what we're facing today. It's the reasons why we at the Indigenous Peoples Organisation has partnered with Better Futures Australia. So it's not only our Indigenous knowledge, as well as our Indigenous scientific knowledge, as Bruce has just explained to us, and is so evident in the story that Chris told us. But that scientific knowledge is what's going to help us to bring back this balance, this cosmological equilibrium that we so desire, so that we can start living together on this planet as we were designed to be, as we were created to be, and as we are supposed to be. We've got a long way to go. So thank you everyone for coming on to this NAIDOC thing here. Sign up, but also speak up, because Mother Earth needs your voice. It needs your voice now. Thanks, Cathy.
Thanks, Uncle Ray.
Thank you, Ray. Your insights and wisdom are always a really valuable contribution. Our final speaker this evening is Dr. Virginia Marshall, who is a Wiradjuri and Yamba woman and inaugural Indigenous postdoctoral fellow at the Australian National University School of Regulation and Global Governance and Fenner School of Environment and Society, whose postdoctoral research focused on water law reform and Indigenous peoples in Australia. Virginia was awarded the 2018 Distinguished Woman Scholar Award from the University of Victoria, British Columbia, and the IATSA Stenner Award for her doctoral thesis titled A Web of Aboriginal Water Rights, Examining the Competing Aboriginal Claim for Water Property Rights and Interests in Australia. Virginia is also the author of the seminal work Overturning Aquanullius, Securing Aboriginal Water Rights in Australia, and is also a principal solicitor working around land and water rights and native title, and another valued member of the IPO executive. Thank you, Virginia.
Thank you so much, everyone, to come after Chris and Bruce and Uncle Ray, and your very kind words, Cathy. That makes my heart really full with joy. I think it's so important to hear about healing country, and that was definitely my journey in writing about country and researching country and gathering all the evidence I could on our side to have people understand our use of water. You know, when Bruce is talking about our foods and our grasses, our use and understanding and relationship to water is so important. I describe that for people to understand as a web of water rights, you know, a web of interest, so they could understand the connectivity to everything. That water is part of us. It's the bitter water, the salt water, the fresh water, and the many other types of water that exist across country for communities and their identity that's held in that water. So I think that, you know, this is what we've sadly faced, and Bruce has pointed out with bush foods, for example, bush tucker. But we've also really applied this in an area that I've been working as a lawyer for 10 years, which is Aboriginal medicines, and the same importance that those medicines will be for the world. But when we also don't treat the water in the way that it deserves to be treated, and that Aboriginal people need to have that relationship directly with water to also exactly in what you said, Bruce, is that understanding of soils and people from our community being there from community. But also with the water, we need to be there. We need to access that water and look after that water, those water holes. That care and love needs to be shared across country. And we have so many stories about why the treatment of water is so important. And we've really failed to see that not only in law, but we failed to see that across this country when we commodified water in 2004 and further separated legally Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people from water and that relationship to water. But it also separated non-Indigenous people from water and for the need to understand the relationship that is since time began. You know, that's an incredibly long time since we've had that understanding, and also to create those barriers that have now been put up to divide water into conquest, to look at it as a commercial water, environmental water, but not see the cultural and the spiritual part of water in our lives and the meaning of water, which Uncle Ray talked about, that spiritual connection and the understanding of our place and also the good health that goes with good drinking water, with ensuring that groundwater is healthy and recharged naturally. You know, to identify that that ancient water in the paleo channels, for example, is living and breathing. It's an entity, but we also, because of this failed policy and failed laws, in a Western sense, that we're clutching for so many different ideas to fill that void, which is the rights of nature, making a separation again between a river and making a separation between a tree or a mountain, a national park, for example, and that's not a natural fit for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Clutching at those voids in a Western sense and in an Indigenous sense only really compounds the problems that we have with water. And I think that the most amazing part of this journey on healing country is, as everybody's pointed out, there's creation stories that really give us a very clear understanding of why those relationships are so important and why they speak of sharing, and that is just so critical. And we saw that with the cool fire farming practices in the bushfire seasons that we had that were dreadful. You know, all around us were days that looked more like a movie set than something that we'd experienced ever before. And along comes this wonderful, big-hearted community, our community, that actually says, well, this is the way you actually manage the bush. This is the way that you manage the soils. and we really want to, you know, share this understanding. And so I think that we've always got to see that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are always looking for ways to come together. And I think that that's what we're doing tonight, is healing country by saying to everyone, non-Indigenous people and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, that for us to actually keep and living on this planet, to enjoy those foods that Bruce is talking about, and to understand the creation stories and the importance of those that Chris pointed out, and to understand the depth of relationship between ceremony and water and our foods and the purpose of why we're here, couldn't be more clear in the whole reality of climate change. Again, you know, it's not that we have to see human beings as the enemy. We have to understand and learn from Indigenous peoples all around the world, and that's very clear on climate change. It gives us an opportunity now to make a difference and to really take on board the science, but take on board the environmental indicators that tell us that there are real problems and that we need to actually be listened to. That all the best science from the West will not really save us, because if we're living on this country, we can't eat cotton, we can't eat a whole range of different Western materials and seeds. You know, they also need to be acclimatized, and the best way to eat foods is from country. Those incredible foods from creation stories is really important. That's what we're going to survive on. We can see that so clearly. And when the fish are dead, when many other foods are not able to be eaten, people will have to return to bush foods. That will be the absolute secret that we know and we understand. And people will be coming to us in years to come. This is quite a matter of fact. And they will be searching for those answers, and it will be our medicines that will cure you. It will be all of those things that we understand. So, you know, it's a really an important step to work with Better Futures Australia in a really productive way, that we can have our voices heard and really take that message through to every one of you tonight. It really is important to have Indigenous-led research, for example. I sit on the ethics committee at ANU, and so many projects are non-Indigenous led, and we really need to have this research supported for everyone's future, but we need to lead. And that's so critical, because when we lead, then we survive. That's really important. So my message tonight is that you need to really take these moments of replaying this wonderful session tonight and the ones to come this week, and to be gracious in your acknowledgement to everyone that, you know, because of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, when you walk out, you're breathing that ancient air. You're absolutely drinking that water that the ancestors had drunk. You're actually standing on land, as Bruce said, that has been cared for thousands and tens of thousands of years. And we are the oldest living culture on the planet. So we must have done something right. We must have done something incredibly right to really be at that stage of our lives. And intergenerationally, we will be here forever. Our children will carry on when we're not here any longer, but those messages will remain with you and your loved ones. And we're always here, and we always will be, to help the rest of the messages to get out during this week, which is healing country, is really healing ourselves. And that's really my message tonight. Mananguru.
Cathy, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Virginia, for contributing your vast expertise and valuable insights and the need for Aboriginal people to lead, and that it's also closely tied to our own healing, to Aboriginal healing. I'd like to encourage anyone who's listening who'd like to post a question to do so, and we'll move to question time shortly. Just before we move into question time, however, I'd just like to take the opportunity to add to the discussions tonight and briefly highlight that all of the environmental and climate concerns we are facing and will hear about during the coming week, that they're all interlinked. Global warming, the overexploitation of natural resources, the decimation of the environment, the unprecedented loss of biodiversity are all intrinsically linked. And it's the same motivation that led to the dispossession and ongoing suppression of First Nations peoples. Originally motivated by imperialism and now corporate globalisation, it's the accumulation of wealth by a few that are the drivers. So the answers are also tied together. These sessions will outline numerous concerns, but they'll also hold answers. COVID has highlighted that we can change where there is political will to meet the threats facing our communities. The existential threat of global warming demands substantial social change, a change from where corporate profits come at the expense of the community. We need to demand a flip from the profits of a few to the well-being of the many. That also means recognising the rights of all peoples, including the inherent and ongoing sovereignty of the First Nations peoples of this continent. We need to reverse the process of dispossession and draw from Aboriginal values as custodians of country and waterways, and recognise our obligations to respect all living things. And I'm pleased to say that this is already starting to happen. The Jabalbina Yalanji Aboriginal Corporation Partnership with Rainforest 4 Foundation have been working together to protect country. The Rainforest 4 Foundation raises funds to purchase vulnerable blocks of Daintree land, which has globally significant conservation and cultural values, which then transfer the land to the Yalanji people. Then the Aboriginal Corporation develops a land management strategy based on the self-determination and protection of the cultural biodiversity and conservation values, and then work with the Queensland Government to have those lands reincorporated into the Daintree National Park. I understand the partnership is the only formalised non-government program in Australia that purchases land for conservation to be owned and managed by the traditional owners. But it's worth noting this is part of a larger global movement to return lands to Indigenous peoples, like the David Suzuki Land Back movement, which seeks to confront colonial abuses and historical dispossession. The Land Back movement seeks to reverse the expropriation of Indigenous lands and draws on Indigenous cultural values of communal responsibility and reciprocity to promote sustainable economies for all humanity. This is what we're here for today, to draw learnings from Aboriginal knowledge of communal responsibility and the custodianship we share for future generations, to take up that shared onus to work together collaboratively to build sustainable solutions to climate change, to ensure a safe future for those coming generations. So we'll move on to questions, if there are any questions coming through.
Yes, Cathy, there's thousands of them.
Oh, are there? Can you
16
go
of
into them? Because I'm not seeing them, to be honest. So would you mind pulling out a few, Ray?
A few, yeah, okay. Anonymous attendee, how can we fight to bring Aboriginal knowledge and culture into current legislation, especially the environment? Your people's love and care and understanding of country is so necessary and should be utilised and respected. Thank you, Virginia.
Virginia, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Uncle Ray. I'm really not into integrating our knowledge where you can't really define Indigenous knowledge and where Western knowledge begins. I think that's just a caution that I have to just raise. But I think it's really important that, and this is one thing that we're trying to do as co-chair for the National Water Committee as we look to make improvements on the National Water Initiative Mark II, is that we really want to impart Aboriginal values, the understanding and the spirituality and our concerns with water being recognised and respected. I think that's a very important point. And I think that we need to do a lot more in coming together and agreeing that to actually protect water, to ensure that water remains in its strength for us culturally, that we need to change our mindsets and really have to also change our ways that we look at the environment and also valuing water, the land, the soils in a much different way. If we can incorporate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander values equally in those respective areas, it will make such a big difference to that recognition and to the way we apply and we respect it. You know, the words that we had in our water clauses in the National Water Initiative was just in regard to acknowledge native title, just to account for. That passive language doesn't even resemble the rich and wonderful history you've heard tonight over tens of thousands of years. It just can't do it justice. So we need to look at that future and really those values need to be incorporated, but can't be integrated to where you don't know where Western law begins and an Aboriginal law ends. Thank you. Managulu.
There's a question here. How can we fight to bring Aboriginal knowledge and culture into current legislation, especially regarding the environment? Your people's love and care and understanding of country is so necessary and should be utilised and respected. Virginia, given that's about legislation, do you want to grab that one as well?
I think the one thing that I come away from, and that was, I was actually teaching environmental law today, and I will be in an intensive over the next 9 days, is that we really fail to understand that law will not help you in every instance, and neither will really bad policy actually aid really bad law. So we really have to be careful what we wish for. Because there are a lot of people that draft in a way that they completely don't understand how to draft these values, how to draft in a way that's with what we've talked about tonight. So I always would think that law should be, Western law should be the last resort, but Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander law should be the first resort. That is critical. We have to acknowledge our laws as the first laws. So that's how I would explain that question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Virginia. I think that's a really critical point, that these issues aren't just legal issues, they're actually political issues. And that's why it's so important for the broader community to have some understanding of the history and the context and the damage that's done to Aboriginal people when they don't have sufficient control over legislation, such as happened with Juukan Gorge, where there's very little cultural heritage protection in the legislation. So we need the broader community support to help address that and bring veto rights back for traditional owners, particularly around sacred sites, so that they can protect them for future generations.
I also have a thought about, and I think about this all the time. You know, I have this belief, this vision that one day non-Indigenous Australians of all diverse backgrounds will one day paint up and do the corroboree, and that's with us. And I see that now. You know, I saw that a couple of years ago walking around on Australia Day, which I don't like, you know, walking around. Years ago, I didn't like walking around because you get some snide remarks, and there was a change. Years ago, it was like Australian flags everywhere, and you know, outside the people having barbecues. But then a couple of years ago, I was walking around from Bondi to the city to go to Yarbin, and what I noticed was there was a lot of non-Indigenous people walking around, going to the Australia Day thing with the Aboriginal flag and the Australian flag. And then I also see, so there's a change there. And then there's also, I see with Dark Emu, a lot of people, non-Indigenous people, have come to me and said, Chris, this has been amazing. I've learned so much about, you know, practices, and this is something that we all should be doing, you know, should be doing within our own homes and their own backyards. So I think there's a change happening, and what we got to do is grab onto that change and not let people distract us from that, because one day people will do the corroboree with us, paint up, and that also means that our practices of sustainability, practices of respecting one another and our people's values of sharing and caring and helping each other will be something that is an Australian value that a lot of people will use. So that it just gives me, I kind of like always feel positive about things, and this is one of the things I see that people are changing, and we're changing as a nation.
And also, I think for the younger generation, there's a few questions around this. To find your voice in all of this, you just need to get yourself really educated on this matter and put it up from wherever it is on your agenda now up to about priority number 1, to make sure that this is right before your consciousness every day, and to see that this is, you know, we're all in this together. This is just not an Aboriginal issue now. We're all in it together. This is your country. This is your planet. This is what you've got an opportunity to show some leadership yourself. And if the politicians ain't going to do it, then we live in a democracy. Democracy is we the people.
Yeah, we the people
have this have that greater responsibility, because we're the ones who are concerned for it.
There's a question here by somebody who's hosting an event called First Nations People and Environmental Justice with the Australian Conservation Foundation. Dr. Virginia Marshall is one of the presenters, and they were wondering if anyone has any advice for the event, or if there is anything that they would like people to know regarding topics such as traditional land care knowledge and sorry, the thing is jumping around on me. Traditional land care, it's just disappeared. Sorry, regarding topics such as traditional land care and knowledge and environmental racism. So have you got any, do any of you have any comments on what are the key issues they should be raising in that presentation?
Good on you, Bruce.
You're muted.
You're muted, bro.
I would like to think that our young people, all our people, when arguing these great arguments in support of those old philosophers in our culture who organised our social world so well, that we will do so in the polite voice that our old people used and still use. Not shouting and screaming and abusing and trying to get our way by denigrating others, but to use the quiet voice, the sincere voice, and being polite and listening. And it was brought home to me a couple of days ago when one of my cultural brothers was telling me a yarn about his meeting with a senior federal government minister about an issue that he has been fighting for 10 years. Now, we did ceremony for that, Chris, about 3 years ago now, for the sacred source of the Ngarrindjeri River, where she comes out of the ground. And it's been destroyed by a feral animal. And, you know, it is something that we can do. That water comes through moss. You trample the moss, you actually destroy the aquifer because the little environmental pump has gone. And that's the great mosses. And we've been working on that for a long time now. But my brother was having a conversation with that federal minister, who is not someone who I thought had been terribly supportive of our people in the past. But she said, if you come to us with a well thought out plan, we will do our best to implement it, as long as everybody is considered. And I think that is great advice. That when you go to a minister, you're not going there to fight. You're going there to put a proposal from our old people in the quiet voice. And if you don't succeed, then you'll have to try again. And if you pass before you've been successful, then your children will have to try. But I think there's too much antipathy in the world, and our old people, as we can see from the way our society was organised, tried to avoid that hatred, tried to build into our discussions consensus. And one of my sisters from East Gippsland taught me this lesson 40 years ago when we were sitting down in a meeting and one of our elders hadn't arrived, and there was a bit of wide agitation about why the meeting wasn't underway, and my sister said, because we are waiting for Auntie, in the meantime, we will talk about country, and that is our real work anyway. And it was a beautiful way of saying, don't panic, we're still on the agenda, you just don't know it yet. And it was said in such a quiet voice, such a gentle way, that I've always remembered it, and I've always thought, when I get angry, because I can do that, to calm that anger, because our old people always kept a still heart when arguing. And I think we just have to be persistent. And my brother told me that beautiful story about that conversation with the federal minister that has given us so much hope, because it was a human conversation. And, you know, I would have been prepared to write off that minister. My brother taught me too soon. Don't write anyone off. And it's a really good lesson.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, there's been,
2 more minutes.
yes, we seem to have flown through the time, and I thought we'd have, you know, about 20 minutes for at least 20 minutes or more for questions. So my apologies. There's quite a few interesting questions too that I thought would be good to touch on, but we also want to have an opportunity to screen a really important film. So before we move on to the film, I'd like to thank all of our speakers tonight and those who also raised questions, all of those who joined us from home. I hope you might be able to raise some of those questions again in the next few days. It's been a really informative and worthwhile discussion. I think you'll join with me in sending a virtual clap around the country for all of our speakers here tonight. I'd also like...
Cathy,
Yeah.
just let me say to the audience that we have Lisa Cliff and James Whelan, who works at both, who's hosting this tonight from Better Futures Australia. And they've got all of these questions anyways. And so we're going to keep these questions. We're not going to dish them, and we'll figure out how we can answer them some way. But the whole focus of this whole week is for us to go to have our agenda for COP22, and also for the next discussions around climate change, maybe in Paris or wherever it is. So thank you for all your questions, because these also help to form the thoughts that we want to take as Indigenous peoples, not only to our Australian government, but also to our international governments, and say, this is our voice. Please listen to us.
Thank you, Ray. I think you're right that we can actually draw the questions and do some written responses. So I encourage you to check out the site over the coming days, and we'll try and respond more fully to the written questions. I'd also like to remind everyone that if you want to join us again, you'll need to register for each day. And for those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mob, we'd welcome your contribution to the workshop that we'll be holding, which will be much more interactive around developing and finalising those priorities that we take to COP26. Before we finish up, we're going to screen a short film, Our Common and Shared Future, which is particularly pertinent for tonight. Provides a beautiful portrayal of the relationship between the traditional owners and the Fitzroy River, which is considered an ancestral being by the traditional owners who've since the beginning of time. But it's currently under mounting threats from big agriculture, irrigation projects and mining. So thank you, and we hope to see you tomorrow for the Healing Our Waterways session, with speakers including Dr. Virginia Marshall, Dr. Anne Polina, Bruce Shillingsworth and Gadrian Hooson. It's bound to be a strong session. Thank you, and we'll run the film now. Thanks, Lisa.
Is very important to Aboriginal people. Even now, I show my grandchildren, get up on the bank and watch the catfish circling. Little catfish, big catfish. That's a Wallangari. Yunguru was singing that Wallangari, the circle, big round. It's going around, and the little one's going opposite way, like a clock. That's the Wallangari for the river. And in the moon, you find a circle. That's for the saltwater, big tide, and Waramba, big flood, Ngalila. We know, we're ready. Not only the wireless and the European telling us on the news, oh, the cyclone of the monsoon coming. Yeah, of course, the country is getting wild, angry. The spirits are getting, Mother Nature getting angry. We're losing all the people, washing the country away. This is got to be stopped by the people. Those people are playing with the nature.
In building our collective consciousness and actions to be creative and adaptive to climate change, we as scientists need to ask ourselves individually and collectively, can we have a common and shared future under climate change? Before we answer these questions as scientists, we must first challenge our own practice and redefine our thinking and understanding of what is science. How can we use multiple forms of knowledge making and application to better respond and adapt to climate change?
We came here a long time. We never knew better. All right? Clean water. Living water, this one. Living water, this one. You never finish it, this water. Living water, this one. We want them. We will grow along this water.
Today we come together because of the need to think and act differently to ensure our knowledge and collaboration is multidisciplinary and includes the active participation of other actors and stakeholders who have a political and influential role which impacts on the lives of people and the planet. I believe we can work together collectively to identify the challenges of land, water, people and the environment in building creative and sustainable solutions to climate change.
The group that is most often overlooked and yet has probably the greatest wisdom of any group in terms of relation to the environment are the Indigenous communities. And so it's absolutely imperative that these communities be involved in the dialogue in addressing issues like climate change and how to mitigate impacts of other pollutants and how to work with communities for future development in a way that's sustainable, in a way that can be maintained without impacting the environment. And so including these communities is absolutely critical.
This lived experience has generated an extensive body of traditional ecological knowledge production and adaptation to learning how to read the country, to read and understand nature by looking for the signs, up in the sky, down in the ground. This has come about through a deep relationship between human and non-human beings in nature. This system of knowledge must be seen and valued as Indigenous science. The ability to include Indigenous science into the collective wisdom of our scenario planning and choice modelling for climate change adaptation can illuminate and empower wiser ways of postmodern living. Our ethics have remained largely anthropocentric. Sustainable life now for the future. It is important to note that sustainable life is not the same as sustainable development, as the latter is increasingly used to promote growth economics with little regard for inherent limitations on ecological systems.
The Kimberley is under attack. We know that there's the potential for coal, uranium, copper, diamonds, bauxite, iron ore, zinc, lead, as well as other precious metals. We know that this industry needs an incredible amount of water. We're really concerned that groundwater would be used and what that would mean for all the pools and the billabongs along the Fitzroy River, particularly in the dry season.
Salt water comes up, you bring the barramundi up here. No one won't believe you. Into this place you see fish here. This is Jarur. Comes from this way and he meet this hot water in here. And this is a place, you know, they say Ungur. Ungur place called Ungur. Come past here, and this spirit from here, he said, "Oh, I'm going. I'm leaving Jaruru." See, he's leave this country. He's move on. This Ungur Jago come here, and this is what they call Jaruru. Ungur Jago ne pendelen manana Jaruru ngamangaring. Jago ne pendelen manana Jaruru ngamangaring.
Climate investment funds must be committed and invested into better understanding the sciences, the industry, and the political challenges and solutions to adapt and respond to the survival of humanity and the planet. This type of investment must be directed towards the design and situational context in order to support the collaboration of regional governance frameworks, which shifts the balance of power to local people and stakeholders who need to vision and build a collective and common future together.
If we're to survive, then we have got to listen to Indigenous peoples, and we've got to build those links between non-Native and Native communities and move forward as partners and in partnership of equals. And coming to the table doesn't mean simply sharing ideas, which is a very important part. It means being part of the decision-making process, not simply being informed after the fact, but being part of determining the steps that are taken forward and being true equals in that process.
By reframing and building collective wisdom, we can better understand how we as human beings can once again start to live in harmony with each other and defend our amazing planet, Mother Earth, from climate chaos and destruction.
We're at a tipping point, and unless we take action now, unless we are forceful emotionally, perhaps in written documents, in video statements, and in relationship building with governmental entities and scientists, unless we take those steps now, this tipping point means that if it tips too far, we won't be able to go back.
We can run the country. We know what the rules are. We never forget. Together, shoulder to shoulder. We know what's right and what's wrong. Sorry about that, but we still got our culture. We still got our role. We still got a role to play.
Thank you all for joining us here tonight, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow night in the next session. Thank you. Bye.